On September 10, 1944, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sat across from General Dwight Eisenhower in a cramped military aircraft on a Belgian airfield and delivered a verdict on his commander that would nearly shatter the Allied alliance. Eisenhower had just outlined his plans for ending the war. Montgomery listened, then erupted in what witnesses described as fierce and unrestrained language. "Your plans," he told Eisenhower, "are nothing but balls, sheer balls, rubbish." He tore apart the file of messages Eisenhower had brought, dismissing the Supreme Commander's strategy with open contempt. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, sat in stunned silence. Then he reached across and placed his hand on Montgomery's knee. "Steady, Monty," he said quietly. "You cannot talk to me like that. I am your boss." Montgomery, his ego suddenly deflated, mumbled an apology, but the damage was done. The two most powerful Allied commanders in Europe had reached a breaking point that would echo through the final 8 months of the war, cost thousands of lives in a disastrous operation called Market Garden, and come within inches of fracturing the partnership that was crushing Nazi Germany. Montgomery believed he knew how to win the war. Eisenhower believed differently. Their disagreement was about to produce one of the most controversial strategic debates in military history. The dispute that exploded in that aircraft had been building for months. It was not merely a clash of personalities, though personalities certainly clashed. It was a fundamental disagreement about how to win the war, wrapped inside a struggle between two nations, two military cultures, and two very different kinds of men. To understand what happened on that airfield, you have to understand who these men were and where they came from. Bernard Law Montgomery was born in 1887 in London, the fourth of 9 children. His father was an Anglican priest who later became Bishop of Tasmania. His mother was a domineering presence who exercised what Montgomery himself called a strict and austere influence over the household. The relationship between mother and son was toxic. Montgomery publicly rejected and criticized her throughout his life. When she died in 1949, he did not attend her funeral, claiming he was too busy. This difficult childhood shaped the man who emerged. Montgomery was brilliant, methodical, and utterly convinced of his own rightness. He had been seriously wounded in the First World War, shot through the right lung at the First Battle of Ypres on October 13, 1914. A soldier tried to drag him to safety and was killed in the attempt. Montgomery lay in a shell hole for hours before being rescued. The experience marked him. He came to believe that careful planning and overwhelming force were the keys to victory, that reckless waste of soldiers' lives was inexcusable. In 1927, Montgomery married Betty Carver, a widow with 2 sons. By all accounts, the marriage softened him. His wife moderated his sharp edges, his extreme single-mindedness, and his intolerance and suspicion of the motives of others. When Betty died on October 19, 1937, from septicemia caused by an insect bite she had suffered while on holiday, these characteristics re-emerged with a vengeance. She died in his arms at age 48, a tragedy that profoundly affected him for the rest of his life. By the time war came, Montgomery was a difficult man to work with, but an effective commander. He took over the 8th Army in North Africa in August 1942, when British fortunes were at their lowest. Within months, he had transformed a demoralized force into a victorious army. His victory at El Alamein in October and November 1942 was Britain's first major land victory of the war. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. Montgomery's soldiers adored him. He practiced what would later be called management by walking around, visiting units constantly, speaking to troops directly, and showing genuine concern for their welfare. Before D-Day, he made a point of visiting American units personally, wanting soldiers to see their commander and hear his voice before going into battle. But Montgomery's peers and superiors found him insufferable. His confidence crossed into arrogance. His certainty became contempt for anyone who disagreed. Winston Churchill is said to have captured his essence perfectly. In defeat, unbeatable. In victory, unbearable. Dwight David Eisenhower was Montgomery's opposite in almost every way. Born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas, and raised in Abilene, Kansas from the age of 18 months, Eisenhower came from modest circumstances. He graduated from West Point on June 12, 1915, part of the famous class the stars fell on, so named because 59 of its 164 graduates eventually became generals, including 2 5-star generals. He spent the First World War training tank crews in Pennsylvania, never seeing combat in Europe. Between the wars, Eisenhower served in various staff positions that gave him experience in organization and administration rather than battlefield command. He worked for General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. He served in the War Department. He was, by all accounts, an excellent staff officer with a gift for getting along with difficult people. When America entered the Second World War, Eisenhower rose with stunning speed. He was a brigadier general when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Within 2.5 years, he was supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, commanding the largest amphibious invasion in history. He had never led troops in combat. His promotion owed everything to his organizational skills and his ability to hold together a fractious coalition. Montgomery privately held Eisenhower in contempt. "Nice chap, no soldier," Montgomery told colleagues. In the summer of 1944, he wrote to the British Chief of Staff, Alan Brooke, that Eisenhower's ignorance as to how to run a war is absolute and complete. He has all the popular cries, but nothing else. Other American commanders shared none of Montgomery's high opinion of himself. General George Patton's diary dripped with venom. "Why an American army has to go with Montgomery, I do not see," Patton wrote on July 5, 1944, "except to save the face of the little monkey." On December 27th, during the Battle of the Bulge, Patton recorded his assessment even more bluntly. "Monty is a tired little fart. War requires the taking of risks, and he will not take them." General Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group and was Montgomery's counterpart, found him stubbornly difficult to work with. Bradley never forgave Montgomery for failing to clear the approaches to Antwerp, a mistake that Bradley believed added months to the war. These were the men who gathered on that Belgian airfield in September 1944. The stakes could not have been higher. The Allies had broken out of Normandy in August and swept across France with stunning speed. Paris fell on August 25th. Brussels fell on September 3rd. The German army appeared to be disintegrating. Victory seemed within reach. But victory was not as close as it appeared. The very speed of the Allied advance had created a crisis that threatened to halt the offensive entirely. The problem was logistics. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, every ration consumed by the Allied armies had to travel over 500 miles from the Normandy beaches. The French railroad system had been deliberately destroyed by Allied bombing before the invasion, a necessary measure to prevent the Germans from rushing reinforcements to the beachhead, but one that now crippled the Allied supply effort. Trucks were the only option for moving supplies forward, and there were not enough trucks in the world to keep 47 divisions supplied across such distances. The numbers were staggering. Each division in offensive operations required approximately 700 to 750 tons of supplies per day. With 28 divisions to supply, daily requirements exceeded 20,000 tons. The distance from the Normandy beaches to the front lines stretched supply lines to the breaking point. The Red Ball Express, That legendary convoy system of American trucks racing supplies to the front was performing miracles. Conceived during a 36-hour brainstorming session in late August, the system began operations on August 25th. At its peak on August 29th, 5,958 vehicles delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. Approximately 3/4 of the drivers were African Americans serving in segregated transportation units, driving around the clock on designated one-way routes to maximize throughput. But even this heroic effort could not keep pace with consumption. Patton's Third Army alone needed 350,000 to 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily. On September 2nd, it received just over 25,000 gallons, roughly 1/18 of what Patton needed. Tanks sat immobile on roads throughout France. Offensives stalled. The pursuit of a beaten enemy ground to a halt. Not because the Germans had stopped running, but because the Allies had run out of gas. By September 12th, Allied forces had reached positions not expected until day 350 of the invasion plan. They had made 260 days of planned progress in just 19 days. Paris fell 55 days ahead of schedule. This extraordinary success had created an extraordinary problem. Montgomery believed he had the solution. "Give me everything," he told Eisenhower. "Halt Patton's Third Army completely. Divert all supplies to my 21st Army Group. Give me at least 12 American divisions from First Army attached to my command. Let me concentrate 40 divisions for a single massive thrust north through Belgium and Holland, across the Rhine at Arnhem, bypassing the Siegfried Line and into the heart of Germany. I can end this war by Christmas." It was audacious. It was bold. Montgomery called it the Schlieffen Plan in reverse, a reference to the German strategy that had nearly won the First World War. He wanted to keep the Allied forces together as a solid mass, punching through weak German defences before they could recover. On September 4th, Montgomery cabled Eisenhower with characteristic bluntness. "If we attempt a compromise solution and split our maintenance resources so that neither thrust is full-blooded," he wrote, "we will prolong the war." Eisenhower disagreed. He favoured a broad front strategy, advancing on multiple axes simultaneously. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would push north toward the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Bradley's 12th Army Group would push east toward Metz and the Saar. The Allies would encircle Germany from two directions rather than gambling everything on a single thrust. Eisenhower's reasoning combined military and political factors. The logistics could support only 12 to 20 divisions as far forward as the Rhine by October. A narrow corridor would require constantly detaching divisions to protect exposed flanks from German counterattack. The preponderance of forces was American, eventually 61 of 72 Allied divisions, and 1944 was a presidential election year in America. This last factor was decisive. There was no possibility, none whatsoever, that Eisenhower would halt the American armies and hand the glory of conquering Germany to a British general. Franklin Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented fourth term. American voters would not accept their boys sitting idle while Montgomery won the war. Eisenhower reportedly told Montgomery during their confrontation, "What you are proposing is this. If I give you all the supplies you want, you could go straight to Berlin, right straight 500 miles to Berlin. Monty, you are nuts. You cannot do it. If you try a long column like that in a single thrust, you would have to throw off division after division to protect your flanks from attack." Montgomery never accepted this reasoning. He continued to press his case with an arrogance that infuriated American commanders. On September 5th, Eisenhower sent a two-part message that, through a communications error, arrived in reverse order on September 7th and 9th, creating further confusion. The message was unambiguous. While agreeing with your conception of a powerful thrust toward Berlin, Eisenhower wrote, "I do not agree that it should be initiated at this moment to the exclusion of all other maneuvers. No reallocation of our present resources would be adequate to sustain a thrust to Berlin." This was the message that triggered Montgomery's outburst 5 days later. This was the strategy the field marshal dismissed with such contempt on that Belgian airfield. But was Montgomery right? Could his narrow thrust have ended the war in 1944? After the war ended, several German generals seemed to support his theory. SS General Kurt Meyer, who had been captured in September 1944, before Market Garden even began, later claimed that the Ruhr had lain undefended in front of the Allied spearheads, and nothing could have prevented Montgomery from occupying Germany's weapons forge. One powerful drive by 10 to 15 Allied divisions into the northwest, Meyer argued in post-war statements, would have broken the backbone of German resistance and ended the war in weeks. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, speaking after his capture in May 1945, considered the northern thrust the obvious move. General Gunther Blumentritt made similar claims in his 1952 biography of Rundstedt. These statements have been cited for decades as evidence that Montgomery was right and Eisenhower was wrong, but they must be examined carefully. They were made after the war by defeated generals speaking to their captors. These men had reasons to cooperate with Allied interrogators during the early Cold War period. Historian John Mearsheimer later documented how some of these accounts were shaped by British military historian Basil Liddell Hart, who had his own agenda in promoting certain narratives. More importantly, these were retrospective statements about what might have been possible militarily, not what was actually feasible logistically or politically at the time. The logistics told a different story entirely. Historian Martin van Creveld conducted perhaps the most rigorous analysis of the narrow thrust question in his landmark 1977 study, Supplying War. He calculated that Montgomery's theoretical 40 divisions would have realistically shrunk to 18 divisions when all operational requirements were factored in, including flank protection, reserves, and supply line security. Even then, an advance only as far as Dortmund was practical, not Berlin. His conclusion was devastating to Montgomery's case. Van Creveld expressed reservations about whether the Allied logistical system possessed the required flexibility to actually execute the narrow thrust, even to limited objectives. The math was simply impossible. Moving 750 tons per day for each of 40 divisions over roads that the Germans would be destroying as they retreated through a narrow corridor that would require constant protection from flank attacks was a logistical nightmare that no amount of boldness could overcome. But Eisenhower, despite rejecting Montgomery's broader vision, did approve a limited test of the narrow thrust concept. On that same contentious day in Brussels, September 10th, he authorized Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in history. The plan was Montgomery's brainchild. Over 35,000 airborne troops would drop into Holland to seize bridges along a 64-mile corridor from Eindhoven to Arnhem. The American 101st Airborne Division would capture bridges near Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne Division would seize crossings at Grave and Nijmegen, and the British First Airborne Division, reinforced by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, would capture the Great Prize, the road bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. Once the airborne troops secured these bridges, British armour from Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks's 30th Corps would race up a single road, crossing each bridge in turn until they reached the Rhine. If successful, the Allies would have a bridgehead across the last great natural barrier into Germany. Several factors drove Eisenhower's approval. The First Allied Airborne Army had been sitting idle in England for months. 18 previous operations had been planned and then cancelled when ground forces overran the intended drop zones. Generals George Marshall and Henry Arnold were pressuring Eisenhower to use this expensive asset before the war ended. There was also intelligence suggesting that German resistance had collapsed. An aura of optimism pervaded Allied headquarters. Victory fever, some called it later. Reports from the front indicated that the Germans were in disarray, their army broken, their defences crumbling, and there were the V-2 rockets. German missiles were being launched at London from sites in Holland. Capturing those launch areas would protect British civilians from Hitler's vengeance weapons. But Operation Market Garden was a gamble, and gambles require luck. Montgomery's luck ran out almost immediately. The airborne landings began on September 17th, 1944, on a beautiful late summer day. The American divisions dropped in the southern and central sectors. They faced hard fighting but captured most of their objectives. The 101st Airborne secured bridges near Eindhoven after intense combat. The 82nd Airborne captured the vital crossing at Grave and established positions near Nijmegen. Though the bridge over the Waal River there would require a legendary assault to secure. On September 20th, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne conducted one of the most audacious operations of the war. At 3 in the afternoon, in broad daylight, under heavy German fire, they crossed the Waal River in canvas boats, scaled the far bank, and stormed the bridge from the north, while British tanks attacked from the south. The crossing cost the regiment over 200 casualties in less than an hour, but they took the bridge. But at Arnhem, at the far end of the corridor, everything went wrong. The British First Airborne Division faced problems before a single paratrooper touched Dutch soil. Their drop zones were located 6 to 8 miles from the bridge. Air commanders had refused to authorize drops closer to the objective, citing concerns about anti-aircraft fire that later proved unfounded. The wooded terrain near the bridge, they argued, was unsuitable for parachute operations and would scatter the drop. Insufficient transport aircraft compounded the problem. The division would arrive in 3 separate lifts over 3 days, sacrificing the element of surprise that was the airborne soldiers' greatest advantage. The first day's drop would land only part of the force. Reinforcements would trickle in over the following days, assuming the weather held. And there was something else, something that intelligence officers knew but commanders chose to ignore. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg were refitting in the Arnhem area. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, part of Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, had retreated there after being mauled in Normandy. These were not the broken remnants that intelligence had described. They were hardened SS veterans with tanks, armoured vehicles, and artillery. The 9th SS had at least 2 operational Panther tanks, and the 10th SS had between 5 and 14 Panzer IV tanks available. Dutch resistance fighters reported German armour near the drop zones. Ultra-intercepts, the decoded German radio traffic that had given the Allies such advantages throughout the war, confirmed the presence of armoured units. The evidence was clear. Major Brian Urquhart, the 25-year-old intelligence officer for the British First Airborne Corps, grew increasingly alarmed. He obtained aerial photographs showing German tanks and armoured vehicles near Arnhem. He presented this evidence to his superiors and urged them to reconsider the operation. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, who commanded the airborne forces, dismissed his concerns. Browning reportedly told him that Urquhart was behaving like a nervous child, suffering from a nightmare. The tanks, Browning suggested, were probably not serviceable at any rate. Urquhart was then removed from duty. He was sent on sick leave for what his superiors called nervous strain and exhaustion. The intelligence officer who had correctly identified the German threat would watch the disaster unfold from a hospital bed. He later went on to become Under Secretary General of the United Nations and lived to age 101. When Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, raised the Panzer concerns with Montgomery on September 15th, just 2 days before the operation, Montgomery dismissed them and refused to alter the plans. The operation would proceed as scheduled. The warnings proved tragically accurate. On the first day, only Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion reached the Arnhem Bridge. Other units were delayed or blocked by German resistance that materialized with shocking speed. Approximately 740 lightly armed paratroopers seized the northern end of the span and occupied buildings overlooking the approach ramps. They were supposed to hold for 2 days until ground forces arrived. Instead, they held for nearly 4, fighting off elements of 2 SS Panzer divisions with small arms, mortars, and anti-tank weapons, while the rest of their division was trapped miles away. The fighting was merciless. German tanks and self-propelled guns systematically destroyed the buildings the British held. Artillery and mortars rained down on the defenders, fires raged through the rubble, ammunition ran low, then ran out. The wounded lay in cellars without adequate medical care. Frost himself was hit by mortar shrapnel around 1:30 in the afternoon on September 20th. The ground relief never came. British armour from 30th Corps, advancing up a single elevated road that the paratroopers grimly nicknamed Hell's Highway, was stopped again and again by German counterattacks and traffic jams. The road was so narrow that a single destroyed vehicle could halt the entire column. German forces repeatedly cut the highway behind the advancing British tanks, severing their supply lines. The bridge at Nijmegen was not secured until the evening of September 20th, 3 days into the operation. Even then, 30th Corps did not push forward immediately. Controversy still surrounds the decision to halt that night, rather than pressing on toward Arnhem, just 11 miles away. By the time British tanks finally approached Arnhem, it was too late. The paratroopers at the bridge had been overwhelmed. On September 21st, the surviving defenders were overrun. Frost, wounded and captured, was carried into German captivity. He would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp before being liberated by American troops in March 1945. The remnants of the 1st Airborne Division withdrew into a defensive pocket at Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem. They held on for 4 more days, fighting desperately against constant German attacks, hoping for relief that never came. Polish paratroopers dropped south of the Rhine on September 21st, tried to cross to reinforce them, but were beaten back. On the night of September 25th, the survivors evacuated across the Rhine in Operation Berlin. Approximately 2,400 men made it back, including over 2,000 British and around 160 Poles. The rest of the more than 10,000 who had landed at Arnhem were dead, wounded, or captured. The British First Airborne Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Total Allied casualties for Operation Market Garden exceeded 17,000. The Rhine crossing that Montgomery had promised would end the war by Christmas was delayed 6 months. The Allies would not cross the Rhine in force until Operation Plunder in March 1945. Montgomery declared the operation 90% successful because it had captured a valuable salient and liberated much of southern Holland. Few historians have accepted this assessment. The objective was crossing the Rhine at Arnhem. That objective failed completely, but there was an even more damaging failure that emerged from the Market Garden debacle, one that historians would later call one of the greatest tactical mistakes of the war. On September 4th, 13 days before the airborne landings, The British 11th Armoured Division had captured the port of Antwerp virtually intact. This was potentially a war-winning coup. Antwerp was one of Europe's largest ports, with peacetime capacity of 80,000 to 100,000 tons per day. The operational wartime capacity was estimated at around 40,000 tons daily. Its quays stretched for nearly 26 miles. Its facilities included over 600 cranes and excellent road and rail connections. The distance from Antwerp to the front lines was only 65 miles, compared to over 400 miles from Cherbourg. Capturing Antwerp undamaged was an extraordinary stroke of luck. The German commander, surprised by the speed of the British advance, had been unable to demolish the port facilities. Belgian resistance fighters from the White Brigade had prevented sabotage. The prize was there for the taking, but Antwerp sits 55 miles up the Scheldt estuary from the North Sea. The Germans still controlled both banks of that waterway. Until those approaches were cleared, not a single supply ship could reach the port. Montgomery knew this. Eisenhower knew this. Everyone in the Allied command understood that opening Antwerp was essential to sustaining any further offensive operations. On September 4th, Eisenhower wrote to Montgomery stating unequivocally, "Of course we need Antwerp," yet Montgomery chose to prioritize Market Garden instead. He assigned the clearing of the Scheldt approaches to the Canadian First Army, then diverted resources away from them to support the airborne operation. The Canadians were left to fight one of the most brutal campaigns of the war with inadequate strength. For 85 days, from September 4th to November 28th, the port of Antwerp sat useless while German forces held the Scheldt. The Battle of the Scheldt, fought through flooded polders and fortified islands, cost the Canadian First Army nearly 12,900 casualties. The fighting was reminiscent of the worst of the First World War, a grinding struggle through mud, water, and wire. The Germans flooded the Dutch countryside by breaching dikes. Canadian soldiers waded through chest-deep water to assault fortified positions. The fighting on Walcheren Island, where German batteries controlled the estuary, required amphibious assaults supported by Royal Navy bombardment. Only after weeks of bitter combat were the approaches finally cleared. Royal Navy minesweepers then spent 3 weeks clearing over 260 mines from the estuary. The first Allied convoy, led by the Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui, did not enter Antwerp until November 28, 1944. Montgomery himself later admitted the error. "It was a bad mistake on my part," he wrote in his memoirs. "I underestimated the difficulties of opening up the approaches to Antwerp. I reckoned the Canadian Army could do it while we were going for the Ruhr. I was wrong." Coming from a man who rarely admitted any mistake, this was a remarkable confession. American historian Charles MacDonald called Montgomery's failure to clear the Scheldt immediately one of the greatest tactical mistakes of the war. Those 85 lost days proved catastrophic. The supply shortage that had halted the Allied advance in September continued through October and into November. The momentum that might have carried the Allies into Germany was lost. The Germans used the breathing space to rebuild their shattered forces, to fortify the Siegfried Line, to prepare one last desperate offensive. The war that Montgomery had promised to end by Christmas would drag on for another 6 months. But the conflict between Montgomery and Eisenhower was far from over. The worst crisis was still to come. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West. 3 German armies, over 400,000 men, with nearly 1,400 tanks and assault guns, smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The attack achieved complete surprise. American intelligence had missed the massive German buildup. The assault fell on thinly held sectors of the front manned by inexperienced divisions, resting after hard fighting, or green units seeing combat for the first time. Within days, a bulge 60 miles deep had been punched into Allied lines. The German objective was Antwerp. Hitler believed that capturing the port would split the Allied armies and force Britain and America to negotiate. The operation was explicitly designed to fracture the Anglo-American alliance. If the Germans could reach the Meuse River and cross it, the road to Antwerp would be open. The German penetration severed communications between General Omar Bradley's headquarters and the American 1st and 9th Armies on the northern side of the Bulge. Bradley, located in Luxembourg, could not effectively command forces north of the German advance. On December 20th, Eisenhower made a controversial but militarily sound decision. He transferred the American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery's temporary command. The forces north of the Bulge would be coordinated from Montgomery's headquarters, while Bradley directed operations in the south. Montgomery acted swiftly and effectively. He deployed British forces to block any German advance toward the Meuse River. He established a coherent defensive front from the chaos. He moved 30th Corps into position to counterattack when the moment was right. German General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded one of the attacking armies, later praised Montgomery's contribution. He turned a series of isolated actions, von Manteuffel said, into a coherent battle fought according to a clear and definite plan. But then Montgomery overreached. In late December, around the 29th and 30th, he sent Eisenhower communications that amounted to an ultimatum. The messages demanded that Eisenhower appoint him permanent commander of all Allied ground forces. One commander must have powers to direct and control the operations, Montgomery insisted. If Montgomery did not receive this authority, he implied, the campaign would fail. Eisenhower's response was immediate and unambiguous. On December 30th, he drafted a message to the combined Chiefs of Staff, the body of British and American military leaders that oversaw the war, stating that he would resign his position unless Montgomery was relieved of command. The alliance could not continue with both of them. One would have to go. The Allied coalition stood on the brink of rupture. Major General Francis de Guingand, Montgomery's chief of staff, learned of the crisis and flew immediately to Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles on December 30th. De Guingand was everything Montgomery was not: diplomatic, tactful, and aware of how his boss's behavior affected others. Throughout the war, he had repeatedly smoothed over conflicts that Montgomery created. De Guingand saw the draft message. He understood what it meant. He begged Eisenhower for time, promising to resolve the situation. Then he flew back to Montgomery's headquarters through terrible winter weather. De Guingand told Montgomery the truth bluntly. If Eisenhower sent that message, the combined chiefs would have to choose between them, and the choice would be Eisenhower. The Americans were providing the majority of troops, the majority of equipment, the majority of everything. The British government would not support Montgomery in a direct confrontation with American power. He would be sacked. His career would be over. Montgomery for once listened. He signed an apology letter that de Guingand had already prepared. The immediate crisis passed, but then came the press conference. On January 7th, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference at his headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium. He had received approval from Churchill to speak to the press about the Bulge operations. His stated intention was to defend Eisenhower against criticism in British newspapers that had questioned the Supreme Commander's handling of the German offensive. What followed was a disaster of Montgomery's own making. Speaking without notes for over an hour, Montgomery described the Battle of the Bulge in terms that infuriated American commanders. As soon as I saw what was happening, he said, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, They would certainly not get over the river. He praised American troops as brave fighting men. He called Eisenhower the captain of our team, but the overall impression, as de Gingand later put it, was one of what a good boy am I self-regard. Montgomery mentioned no American generals by name except Eisenhower. The implication, whether intended or not, was that he had personally saved the situation from American bungling. The tone was devastating. American commanders who had fought desperately to hold the Bulge, who had suffered tens of thousands of casualties in brutal winter combat, heard Montgomery claiming credit for their victory. Then German propaganda made everything worse. Nazi broadcasters hijacked the BBC frequency and transmitted an altered version of Montgomery's remarks. The fabricated broadcast included statements Montgomery never made, culminating in a line designed to inflame American resentment. The Battle of the Ardennes can now be written off, the fake broadcast claimed, thanks to Field Marshal Montgomery. Bradley's own staff heard the broadcast and initially fell for the trick. American newspapers picked up both the real and the fabricated versions. The reaction was volcanic. Bradley told Eisenhower that he could no longer serve under Montgomery. If the command arrangements were not changed, Bradley would request reassignment. Patton backed him. Both generals threatened to resign unless something was done. Eisenhower wrote to British Chief of Staff Alan Brooke that no single incident throughout his experience as an Allied commander had been so difficult. The alliance that had survived 3 years of war was fracturing over wounded pride and a press conference. Churchill intervened. On January 18th, he addressed the House of Commons and delivered a pointed message aimed directly at Montgomery and the British press. "Care must be taken in telling our proud tale," Churchill said, "not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." He noted that Americans had engaged 30 or 40 men for every one British soldier engaged, and had lost 60 to 80 men for every British casualty. The message was unmistakable. Montgomery had overstepped. The Prime Minister was publicly correcting him. Montgomery eventually recognized his error. Distorted or not, he later wrote, "I think now that I should never have held that press conference. So great was the feeling against me on the part of the American generals that whatever I said was bound to be wrong. I should therefore have said nothing." Eisenhower's assessment was equally stark. "I doubt if Montgomery ever came to realize how resentful some American commanders were," he wrote in his memoirs. "They believed he had belittled them, and they were not slow to voice reciprocal scorn and contempt. The alliance held, but it held because Eisenhower possessed the diplomatic skills to manage impossible personalities, because de Guingand repeatedly saved Montgomery from himself, and because Churchill understood that victory required subordinating British pride to American power. Adolf Hitler had designed the Ardennes offensive explicitly to split the Anglo-American alliance. He believed that an alliance between capitalist America and imperialist Britain was inherently unstable, that the strain of the offensive would fracture it beyond repair. He was almost right. The operation came closer to succeeding politically than militarily. Montgomery's arrogance and the American commanders' resentment brought the alliance to the breaking point. It survived through luck, through the intervention of wiser men, and through the fundamental recognition that losing together was worse than winning imperfectly. So, who was right in the great strategic debate? 8 decades of historical analysis have not produced a definitive answer, but a consensus has emerged. The majority of historians side with Eisenhower. Van Creveld's logistics analysis raised serious doubts about the feasibility of the narrow thrust. The political impossibility of halting American armies to let the British win the war was never seriously in question. Market Garden's failure demonstrated the vulnerabilities of a single line of advance. The German resurgence in the Ardennes proved that the enemy was far from beaten and could still concentrate for devastating counterattacks. Even Montgomery's own chief of staff opposed the narrow front strategy. De Guingand raised political and administrative objections to the plan, though Montgomery later claimed not to recall this dissent. But a minority view persists. Some historians argue that Montgomery's operational concept was militarily sound, even if the logistics and politics made it impossible. British historian C.J. Dick concluded that all things being equal, Montgomery's operational idea was the best, but all things were not equal, and politics was the more important limiting factor. What seems clear is that both men were partially right and partially wrong. Montgomery was wrong that a narrow thrust could have ended the war in 1944. The logistics alone made it extremely difficult, and the politics made it unthinkable. But Eisenhower's broad front approach did grind to a halt in the autumn of 1944. The war was not won until May 1945, 6 months after Montgomery's promised Christmas deadline. The tragedy of Market Garden, those 17,000 casualties in the attempt to prove the narrow thrust viable, encapsulates the terrible cost of strategic disagreement at the highest levels of command. The two men appeared to reconcile after the war. When Eisenhower served as NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander Europe from April 1951 to May 1952, Montgomery served as his deputy. They worked together without major incident. Eisenhower even painted Montgomery's portrait in the spring of 1952, inscribing on the back, Field Marshal Monty, from his friend Ike, 1952. Montgomery later sold this portrait at auction in 1969. The old warriors seem to have made peace, but Montgomery's memoirs, published in 1958, shattered the reconciliation. The book contains self-serving accounts of the war that blamed Eisenhower for prolonging the conflict and causing unnecessary casualties. Montgomery portrayed himself as the military genius, repeatedly overruled by a political general who did not understand war. Eisenhower was wounded and furious. He wrote afterward that he could not forget how Montgomery was always ready to belittle his subordinates at critical times when everyone's cooperation was indispensable. Late in life, Eisenhower told historian Cornelius Ryan what he really thought of Montgomery. "He is a psychopath," Eisenhower said. "Do not forget that. He is such an egocentric that everything he has ever done is perfect. He has never made a mistake in his life." Montgomery died on March 24, 1976, at the age of 88. Eisenhower had died on March 28, 1969, 7 years earlier. They never resolved their differences. The bridge at Arnhem was renamed the John Frost Bridge on December 17, 1977, honouring the lieutenant colonel who had held it against impossible odds. The battlefield is now a memorial site. Every September, commemorations honour those who fought and died there. The strategic debate continues in military academies and history departments. Scholars still argue about whether the war could have ended sooner, whether different decisions might have saved lives, whether ego and politics cost more than necessary. But perhaps the most important lesson lies not in who was right or wrong about the narrow thrust or the broad front. Perhaps the lesson lies in what almost happened in that crucial winter of 1944 and 1945. The Allied coalition nearly shattered. The partnership that was winning the war came within a signed message of breaking apart. It survived, not because Montgomery was right, or because Eisenhower was right, but because enough people understood that the coalition itself was more important than any individual strategy or any individual ego. Montgomery never learned that lesson. He went to his grave believing he had been right all along, that his genius had been frustrated by lesser men, that history would vindicate him. Eisenhower understood it instinctively. He spent his entire war managing egos, smoothing disputes, holding together an alliance of nations and personalities that agreed on almost nothing except the need to defeat Nazi Germany. The veterans who survived the conflict carried these memories with them for the rest of their lives. The paratroopers who fought at Arnhem, the tankers who raced up Hell's Highway, the infantrymen who slogged through the Scheldt, they knew the human cost of high command decisions in ways that no historian ever could. Many of them had opinions about Montgomery and Eisenhower. Some admired Montgomery's concern for minimizing casualties, his philosophy that battles must be won with the least possible loss of life. His soldiers loved him for it. They knew he would not waste their lives in futile attacks. Others resented his arrogance, his condescension, and his apparent belief that he alone understood how to wage war. Almost all of them respected Eisenhower. He was not a battlefield commander in the traditional sense. He was something else, something perhaps more important. He was the man who held the alliance together, who kept the British and Americans fighting side by side when national pride and personal ego threatened to tear them apart. In the end, that may have mattered more than any strategic decision. The Germans were defeated not by a single brilliant thrust or a methodical broad advance, but by the combined might of nations that managed to work together despite their differences. The history you have just heard carries lessons that echo into our present day. Leaders still struggle to subordinate ego to common purpose. The tension between bold action and prudent caution, between concentration and distribution of effort, between national interest and collective goals, these dilemmas have not disappeared. The men who argued in that aircraft over Belgium 80 years ago were grappling with questions that still matter. How do you hold together an alliance of strong-willed nations? How do you balance military logic against political reality? How do you make decisions when the stakes are life and death and the consequences are uncertain? They did not always get it right. Montgomery's arrogance cost lives at Arnhem and delayed victory by failing to open Antwerp. Eisenhower's broad front approach may have prolonged the war in ways that cost additional lives. The truth, as is often the case in history, is complicated. There are no perfect answers, only choices and consequences. But they won. Despite their flaws, despite their disagreements, despite coming within inches of breaking apart, the alliance held, the war ended, and Nazism was destroyed. That achievement, messy and imperfect as it was, deserves to be remembered. So does the cost. The 17,000 casualties at Market Garden, the nearly 13,000 at the Scheldt, the tens of thousands more in the Battle of the Bulge. These were not abstract numbers. They were fathers and sons, brothers and friends, young men who will never grow old. Their sacrifice, and the sacrifices of all who served in that terrible war, should never be forgotten. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories that shaped our world. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from descendants of those who served to students of history to those who simply want to understand the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.